Welcome to the Heal Your Hunger Show, where we get to the heart of why you overeat and how to stop. If you struggle with food and weight like I did, welcome home. Welcome everybody to the Heal Your Hunger Show. So happy to have you here. It is a great day to be alive. And I'm excited about my guest today because he shed some interesting light on the topic of genetics and how it affects our relationship with food, potentially. So we dig into that, and I think you're really going to love this. If you're at the Heal Your Hunger Show for the first time, welcome. We're so happy you're here. I'm happy you happened upon us. And what we do here is we talk about the real stuff. Of course, I interview guests and we talk about all kinds of things that pertain to emotional eaters and our relationship with food, or just our relationship with life, which oftentimes leads to a tortured relationship with food. And then I do shows where it's just me talking about my own experience, my own bumps along the way, things I learn, all pertaining to how to have a healthy relationship with food, one that isn't tortured, one that is peaceful, self-caring, self-loving, and nurturing. Wouldn't that be nice? That's what we talk about here. And if you're here for the first time, welcome 100 times over. And if you've been here before, I so appreciate you tuning in again. That means the world to me. If I ever say anything that you're like, wow, okay, mic drop, and she gets me, or perhaps she's read my mail, send me an email. You can always send me an email. Just write to me, send it to questions@healyourhunger.com, and it will get to me. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you personally. I mean that. I'm not too busy. I'm not too important. It means the world to me if I ever hear from somebody who's listened to my show and touched by it in any way. That touches me. That absolutely touches me. So don't hesitate to reach out. I would be really honored to hear from you. And I certainly will get back to you directly myself. Yes, just me. So I want to also say that we have a quiz on the Heal Your Hunger website that is a great place to start if you are just exploring emotional eating, if you know that you're an emotional eater or you don't know you're an emotional eater. If you take the quiz, you'll find out where you are on the emotional eating spectrum, which is super important because there's different steps you might want to take depending on where you are on the spectrum, whether you're an emotional eater, a food addict, or somewhere in between. You get a personalized score when you take that free quiz. It takes 3 minutes to take. It's not a big deal. But boy, oh boy, it could change your life. So go to healyourhunger.com and take that quiz. And lastly, join us in Facebook at The Secret Sauce to End Emotional Eating. A little play on words there, of course. The Secret Sauce. We talk about real things, real issues around emotional eating and your relationship with food. I also make announcements there that you'll be the first to hear before anybody else hears about it. So definitely join us there on Facebook. I think that's all I got. I adore you. I appreciate you. And I'm excited for you to hear this episode. On with the show. Dr. Sam Shay, so happy to have you here. I'm glad that you are here on the Heal Your Hunger show. It's great to see you as always.
Thanks, Tricia. It's great to see you too.
Yeah. And we've known each other for a good number of years and in the health space and networking and being in our consortium of really holistic health practitioners. And so I've always loved seeing you and also hearing what you're up to, especially now, because you're doing some really cool stuff that is of interest, I think, to people who struggle with food and weight, especially when there are genetic components, as you've pointed out, to their journey of hunger and satiety. So can you tell us a little bit about your own story? Because I think that's a great place to start.
Sure. I started very young, very ill, and it began with massive stress with my parents' nuclear divorce when I was age 6, and me and my siblings were caught in the blast radius, and compounding that with a tremendous amount of stress and violence at school and gaslighting at home. It led to a video game addiction, a sugar addiction, overeating, and a coffee addiction, all starting at age 6. And I literally drank coffee to stay awake for school because I couldn't, my insomnia was so terrible from everything that was going on. I couldn't get to sleep, stay asleep, and I would wake up exhausted. So.
Wow. At age 6, you were using coffee as a drug.
I was.
Oh my God. Did you put a lot of sugar and cream in it to be able to handle it?
Well, it was sugar and then like fat-free milk because evidently I was told my cholesterol was too high at that age. And
Wow.
a low-fat, high-carb diet. And by
Which
by
was wonderful for your health.
hilarious in retrospect. But both my parents were psychiatrists, so they didn't know anything about actual diet or health. And my pediatrician was just towing the line of an 80s medical doctor. And there was no real discussion or interest in anything except just towing the line. And then my parents just wanted to medicate me into submission.
Yep.
So I had to, I had,
Sorry, I'm laughing. It's not funny, but
it's, don't worry about it. I'm a stand-up comic
I
also.
know.
And so I have lots of material based on my past. So I'm glad I'm making you laugh. It's what I do, you know. I'm actually, this is true story. I'm going to be performing my first, as of the date of this recording, I'm going to be performing my first 1 hour full comedy special at the Denver Fringe Festival on what it's like to have Asperger's. And
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah. And so pulling from my history has been quite a rich source material.
Right?
And
yeah, lots of fodder.
the emotional eating was massive. I would literally sit there with a remote control in one hand and a bag of M&Ms, like a 3-pound bag, and just go through it to numb out. And the sugar addiction lasted for 15 years, and the video game addiction lasted 25. In fact, at the date of this recording, on April 28th, 2024, is my 10-year anniversary of being sober from video games.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. And you know, people like heal your hunger is also like heal your gaming. There's a lot of overlap. It's not identical, but there's plenty that overlaps.
No question. You know, when the goal is to numb, anything will do.
Right.
We have our, you know, our drug of choice, but of course, you know, why stop at one?
Right. You can get twice the numbing.
Right.
So then, and in high school, I had to make a decision that I'm either going to change my life or end my life. And so I chose to pursue the natural medicine route because Western medicine was epically failing me. And so that's what I did. I got a glorified pre-med in college, along with a holistic health practitioner degree on the evenings and weekends with a writing minor also. And then got my doctorate in chiropractic, was a functional neurologist with extra for 8 years, and then got an acupuncture degree also, and then became certified with the Kalish Institute for Functional Medicine and then the Institute for Functional Medicine, and then genetics. And so the genetics, I've been doing genetics since 2016.
Okay.
And that's I feel like a real missing piece for people who struggle with emotional eating. And my intention with sharing genetics is not to say, just learn your genetics and everything will be fixed with your emotional eating. That is not a thing. That is not a thing.
Yeah.
What is a thing is that there are genetic layers and variables and complexities that are adding extra burdens on people's emotional eating that can be addressed, because some people's emotional eating is a combination of emotional eating augmented and accelerated by genetic vulnerabilities that can be minimized. And that's what I want to help people with, is what are the genetic levers we can pull to drop the burden on the emotional system. And that's the honest way to talk about genetics, as how can we just dial it down, dial the negative influences down so that the emotional stuff is less oppressive. And then, of course, with all the things you talk about and all the tools and resources you have, like how do you address the core emotional component, but realize the emotional component could be just emotions plus genetics. It's not all emotions. And
absolutely. And, you know, the heavier our emotional burden, the harder it is to not emotionally eat if you're prone to use food as a coping mechanism.
Absolutely.
So anything we can do to reduce our emotional burden is vital, absolutely vital, because that just makes life harder. And the harder life is for us, the more likely we are to turn to food. So Thanks for sharing all that. Will you talk about maybe some examples of how genetics affect our relationship with food?
Sure. So there's, of the entire genetic code, there's anywhere ranging from 25,000 to 30,000 genes. Of those, after a number of different filters, there's only about like 100 to 150 genes that are peak level influence on one's health. Like there's hundreds and thousands of genes that influence, but they're downstream. So I'm just talking about the upstream ones. And one of the big upstream ones, particularly because 90% of all adults use caffeine. It's the number one most used drug in the world for adults is caffeine. So we'll just start there. So there, at minimum 10% of the population, of which I am one, has genetic variants that cause, quote, caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. So I thought my coffee was the most bulletproof ever, and it didn't matter because the caffeine was turning into an anxious, depressed mess. I was conflating anxiety with energy. That was the mistake.
Yeah.
And if you are an emotional eater, like I was, and you're taking like, okay, I'll just have coffee because I can have energy and it'll feel like I'll just put lots of coconut oil and I'll feel full and it'll be great. And I'm like doing something healthy, etc. I was actually adding to the emotional load when I thought I was helping it. So once I learned that, and it was right, I didn't know this until I ran my gene profile. And I was like, oh, wow, that's a thing. Can't ignore that.
Wow.
Okay, can't do caffeine anymore. So that's one example of dropping the emotional load based on one's genes.
Yeah, and I will say, because just as citizens of the world, we tend to be lacking in energy because stress is highest probably ever than ever. And so we use caffeine as a form of energy. And I love what you're saying is that it can create the emotions and the tough emotions that can not only deplete our energy, right? If you're depressed, you're not feeling too energized, but also make us feel just crappy where we use quick fixes to feel better.
Absolutely. So caffeine is one of them. It's a great one to lead off because it affects a lot of people. Another one, some people are genetically histamine intolerant. And histamine, the best way I've can figure out how to explain histamine is that histamine is the body's flood switch to drown out venom. Evolutionarily, spiders, insects, snakes, centipedes, scorpions, certain plants, whatever it might be, a bee stings your arm, and I promise I'll connect it to food. I promise. A bee stings your arm, and your arm swells up. The bee did not inject a half quart of water into your arm. That's not a thing. But what did happen is that the venom got poked into the arm, and then the body tripped the histamine flood switch. We got to flood the area with water to dilute the venom, because if we don't dilute the venom's going to corrode and erode muscle, veins, arteries, nerves, and if the venom is bad enough, bone. So histamine is the flood switch. So some people have a genetically much stronger flood switch than others, I suspect because there was a genetic pressure that they lived in a highly venomous area. And the problem with histamine is that if you are sensitive to histamine and you eat histamine-based foods, such as like, and some people are not going to like the sound of this, is like avocados, beans and pulses, bananas, chocolate, alcohol. Like histamine can either be in the food or the food itself can trigger the creation of histamine in the body, or the food itself can block the breakdown of histamine. Those are three separate ways histamine can increase based on different food items. But what happens is that if you are sensitive to histamine and you eat, anyone can look up high histamine foods on the internet. It's really simple and quick. If you eat these foods and you have higher histamine, it's like having a slow-moving bee sting spread through your whole body. And then what happens there? Number one, your whole body starts to retain water. So you start to have that puffy weight experience. It doesn't go away through more exercise and dieting. So there's a more emotional eating because of lack of self-esteem, because you've gotten all this layered puffy weight. That's number one. Number two, if you're sensitive to histamine, you're at higher risk of headaches, itchy skin, hives, digestive issues, and fatigue. And all of those things can trigger more emotional eating.
eating, right?
Exactly. So that's the connection of if you're sensitive genetically to histamine and you're eating histamine-based foods, you may then have emotional eating as a response to unknowingly the increase in histamine load in your body. That's another example.
That's super fascinating. Yeah, I've heard a lot about that, about histamine and histamine reaction. Okay, and so how does somebody identify this in their body?
Well, so there's 3 ways to identify histamine sensitivity in particular. One is you check your genetics and see if you've got the genetic variations that you are genetically vulnerable to histamine foods. Number 2, if you eat higher histamine foods and you actually pay attention to which ones are histamine based, and you notice, do I get headaches? Do I get itchier skin? Do I have more fatigue? Do I get hives? Like for me, I get headaches if I have too much chocolate, for example. I can feel the headache come on. I was like, whoa, okay, that was not good. The other way is you can do a blood test for histamine and see if you have high histamine overall. So you can do a functional test, which is the blood draw genetics test, or you can do just track your own experience.
Okay.
So that's caffeine, that's histamine genetics. The third gene to look at is just straight up satiety. That there's genes for, I mean, there's a major one, but like you look at the gene for satiety, and there's some people have a variation, like I do, where they just don't feel full. They don't feel satiated from normal amounts of food. So satiation is, people think I don't feel full, I have to eat more, my stomach isn't full. No, satiation, the signal that you're full is in the brain. It's not in the stomach. The stomach sends the signal to the brain. If you have a genetic variation, that signal can get delayed. And so people have a genetic delay if people have a genetic delay in their satiety genes, and they're going to not feel full when they technically should. And so then there's going to be a risk of overeating. So like strategies involved with that, if people have that gene, is that they consciously wait about 10 minutes at the end of a reasonable amount of food to see if the signal kicks in 10 minutes later, as opposed to just keep eating until like they've surpassed the full mark, but they keep eating for another 10 minutes.
Which is a good idea for all of us, by the way.
Yeah.
Regardless of our genes, right?
Mm-hmm. And then there's also eating foods that are higher in bulk. So the stretch signal gets there faster, whether it's like fiber. And there's also one thing, they talk about like slow down, but chew more, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with chewing more is that if you count to 30 every bite you take, 1, 2, 3, like you're going to drive yourself nuts. And that's just so not practical.
I can't do it. I'm sorry. I've tried it. I'm like,
I have a solution.
Gulp. Oh no.
I have a solution. So instead of counting for 30 chews, as you're chewing and obviously your tongue is blocking the back of your throat so you don't swallow while you're chewing, so you can keep breathing through your nose. What you do is you chew for 3 full breaths. And that's about 30 chews. And so you're slower and you're only counting to 3, you're not counting to 30. And
I like that.
It's a really easy, that is one hack,
Uh-huh.
a hack.
And that's a takeaway for everybody. I love that. That's good.
So,
and it's also just when you breathe, you relax, right? And
TedX,
you're not using the food to calm you down. You're breathing to calm down.
Absolutely. So there's a satiety gene, okay, as another gene to look at. Then there's another gene that's very interesting. It's around your bitter taste perception. So some people are non-tasters of bitter foods and some people are super tasters. Now, this relates to emotional eating in the following way. It's not direct, it's a bit indirect, but I feel like there's a big influence on it. People who are super tasters for bitter. Now, evolutionarily, the reason why there's a variation is, to me, when in doubt, I go to evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. So when we look at bitter, the very back of the tongue is all bitter. It's cranial nerve 9. Cranial 7 is for the front and the sides of the tongue. Cranial nerve 9 is the back of the tongue. Cranial nerve 9 is only for bitter. And for the Scrabble enthusiasts out there, it's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. And why is bitter in the back and not the front? Because as hunter-gatherers, things that were bitter were generally poisonous. So if you were silly enough to swallow something potentially poisonous, it would always have to pass by the back of the tongue before it went to the throat. So give us the opportunity to, one, gag it up or throw it up. Or if we continue to swallow it and it went down our esophagus, cranial nerve 9 will then trigger cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, to drown that thing in acid. To denature poisons or proteins, and you dunk it in acid, you'll denature the protein. So that's also one reason, European cultures especially, they have their bitters first. It's to harness that reflex to improve digestion. You're taking it over, hijacking it. That's what I'm looking for. You're hijacking the bitter flavor to improve digestion. So for people that are super tasters for bitter, they were less likely to die from something poisonous because they could detect bitter like instantly. At the trade-off, and it's all about trade-offs, the trade-off is that they would not eat nutritious, yet bitter, yet non-poisonous vegetables, like broccoli or whatever, these other things. So the people who are non-tasters of bitter, they had a higher risk of dying from poison, but they had a much wider array of vegetables and plants that they could eat that they weren't so averse to. So it's a trade-off. So people who are super tasters for bitter, they statistically eat they eat over 100 pounds fewer vegetables per year than people who are non-tasters for bitter. So they're losing out on fiber, they're losing out phytonutrients, and they're craving things that are sweeter, emotional. So there's a higher propensity towards not feeling as full with the high fiber yet bitter vegetables. So that's related back to the satiety gene we just talked about. Mm-hmm. And they're a higher risk of craving more sweet things, which is a way higher risk of emotional eating just because the way our brain is wired around sweet foods.
Yeah.
Did I make a case for the bitter gene and emotional eating?
Yes, it's very interesting. Very interesting.
So then there's another gene. There's all sorts of genes. There's another gene, but wait, there's more. There's a gene specifically around craving sugar. So like me, lucky me. So there's a gene for craving sugar. Now, why would anyone be cursed with this gene for, again, I go back to evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. If things don't make sense, I just go back further to see if there's a meta principle that can apply. All right. This is also true. I was literally preparing a talk on the gene of craving sugar, and I was preparing it on Mother's Day. Why do I remember that? Because the local organic store, Natural Grocers, had a Mother's Day sale where they're saying, if you come in and buy anything, we will give you a free organic chocolate bar of your choice from this brand. Okay. I read that just as the email thing that came to me before I started preparing my talk. Here's what happened to my brain. I was literally thinking about that chocolate bar the whole way as I was putting this thing together. And I'm observing my mind, which craves sugar, that it was presented an opportunity to go forage. And literally that's what my foraging brain, except foraging is over in the grocery store, not amongst the plant groups or hunting down something. My foraging circuitry, that's the right word, my foraging circuitry kicked into full gear because I was like, sugar, like it was.
Oh, trust me, you're preaching to the choir here. We all get it. We all know about obsessing about sugar.
Right. So the gene made me more vulnerable to like, why would that craving sugar gene even exist? Because I realized in myself, I was way more motivated to go forage if I had this gene that was craving sugar, which means as a hunter-gatherer, I'm going to go gather some more stuff and I'm going to have more calories because I'm more motivated to find them.
But aren't we evolutionarily, more prone to like sugar anyway? Like you don't necessarily have to have that gene. Like sweet foods, we evolved as species to crave or be drawn to this taste of sweetness.
Yeah, there's variation amongst the drawing. So some people are it's like super tasters for bitter and non-tasters. There's a spectrum, everyone is vulnerable to sugar. Your brain has no genetic defense against sugar, but some people are like extra special, crispy, vulnerable to it.
Yep.
It's
Well,
a big
most
degree.
emotional eaters are, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the number one thing that we binge on is sugar,
Yeah.
and processed carbs, which of course metabolize the sugar in our bodies.
Correct.
So yeah, so I mean, my guess is whether people have that genetic, predisposition or not. Obviously, there's other factors involved, and when we've used sugar as a coping mechanism for so long to numb our pain, and it's done a good job of lighting up our reward center in our brain, the habit of knowing that about sugar, couldn't that contribute to that predisposition, let's say, that the people with the genetic.
People who have the predisposition, what's practical about knowing if you're extra vulnerable to sugar? Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a great question. What's practical is the following. Number one, don't fight your willpower, change your environment.
Amen.
So that's number one
Yeah, willpower ain't gonna cut it.
willpower is very, very difficult to rally. It's very,
Yeah.
very difficult, particularly if you're tired or upset or all these other
Question.
things.
Yeah.
The other thing to do is that if people are genuinely vulnerable to craving sugar, that's where it's even more important to know genetically what your ideal diet is, so your blood sugars don't do this roller coaster, so that you're
Mhm.
not compounding your craving for sugar on top of sugar spiking.
So if you have that gene or that genetic, whatever you call it, predisposition, how does that inform your diet except, I mean, the obvious, which is don't eat sugar or stay away from sugar and processed carbs?
So there's certain foods and herbs that help fight sugar cravings.
Okay.
So for example, like gymnema is a famous herb that's used to cut sugar cravings. Cinnamon, fenugreek, kudzu, berberine. These are not prescriptive. Don't just go out and get them. There's some people that, they're very strongly react to things like berberine and cinnamon, like the blood sugar can drop quite a bit. So there are certain things that people can do to mitigate sugar cravings. Also having, getting your genes tested for what your optimal diet is. That's another thing, but it's a nice lead into it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are genetically more suited for keto. Some are more genetically suited to paleo. Some are genetically suited to Mediterranean. Some are actually genetically suited to high carb. And there's a specific gene that you look for, not the variation of it, but the number of duplicates of it. It's called, there's a three-dimensionality to genetics analysis that almost no one has heard about and almost no one does anything with. It's called copy number analysis. It's not the type of gene, like is it a red dot, green dot, or red, yellow, green, or red dot? It's how many duplicates of it. The best way to think about it is that if my digestive system's a 4, there's these carb Visigoths or Vikings charging the 4. I have cannons lining the 4. Now, the type of cannon, does it shoot out 90 things per unit of time or 95 or 100? That's the variation of the gene. That's the version of the cannon. So what's better, having a perfect cannon that shoots 100 units per of this carb cutting enzyme, or to have 6 of the red version, which shoots 90. So you got 6 times 90 versus 1 times 100. And that's the difference. There's looking at the number of duplicates of this cannon, the duplicates of this gene is way more important than the version of the gene. So people have fewer numbers of these cannons. They're more on the paleo and then eventually into keto side if they've got like only one. And then people who have higher numbers, they're more into the Mediterranean or higher carb Mediterranean or even just the high carb. And if you know your genetic predisposition, then you can modify your diet accordingly so you're not having these big spikes and troughs. Now, they're not evenly distributed. There's definitely not as many high carb people on the planet as there are kind of more in the middle Mediterranean into paleo. It's a bell curve, like with most things. So if you know your optimal genetic, like for me, I had like a perfect Portlandia Mediterranean diet where I knew the names of my farmers and their chickens. And, it was grains, it was protein, it was this, but I was still having these like ups and downs and cravings and crashes and all the rest of it. And I didn't understand because it was like perfect, organic, local, blah, blah, blah. And when I ran my genetics, it turned out I had the second lowest carb tolerance you can have. I was paleo bordering keto. It wasn't a carb quality issue. It was a carb quantity issue.
Interesting. Interesting. This is all really cool stuff, Sam. Thank you for sharing it. What kind of testing does somebody, want to look into having?
Currently, in terms of that last test, the carb tolerance one, there's hardly anyone in the States doing it. I'm one of them. In fact, we're looking.
Okay.
We currently have to send the swabs off to another country to get them analyzed, but we're looking to onshore a U.S. lab to handle. So there's less of a time delay. But if people are interested in getting their genetics actually tested, my website has an entire section on the Genetics Plus program, and there's an option of a do-it-yourself where you just do the cheek swab and send it off, and we'll handle the mailing out to the other country, and then you report the online back-end resource portal and everything to do. And then there's also an office hours version where I'm on office hours weekly, and we're going over topics and we're answering questions. So people,
that's so awesome. I love that. I want to do that. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's fun and super helpful.
And I know you have an ebook, is that a good place for people to start or go straight to your website?
Well, they can do either. I mean, both lead to the website. So the ebook is actually an ebook plus a mini course. So I've added a free mini course along with the ebook where it's describing genetics in great detail. On my website, it's just it says just from drsamshay.com. You just click on the Genetics Plus program up in the top, and just it explains the whole program. There's another video explaining what's involved, and you just pick which version you want to do. It's all just right there. And the ebook. Okay. Ebook is a great place to start if people just want to explore. The website has plenty of info. And I've also got tons of other genetic talks on my YouTube channel.
Awesome. So the ebook is drsamshay.com/genetics. That's a free ebook. So you guys can check that out.
And mini course.
Yeah. Okay, great. And the course. And all of it, I guess you can also get at drsamshay.com in its own right. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I have one last question for you, please. And that, because of the Heal Your Hunger show, it's a deep question. You ready? What is your deepest hunger?
My primary, I think, service in this life is to help people exit survival mode and re-enter community. I can draw a straight line back to my experience of being gaslit, isolated, totally in stress. It's in my comedy set. My body contracted into a near permanent state of fight or flight, head forward, arms bent, toe walking. I was called kangaroo in school because I was just so stressed out.
Yeah.
And the journey from my understanding of trauma is that it's separation. And there's two types of separation. One is I separate off from the tribe in order to maintain my authenticity, or I cut off a part of my authenticity in order to stay melded with the tribe. And both of those are traumas of separation. And the capital T separation is when both happens at the same time. I leave the tribe and cut off a part of myself. And so for me, it's how can I help people come out of survival mode, come out and re-enter community. And that's my hunger. That's what drives me. And that's why I do this work. And it's why I'm doing the comedy. The comedy itself is, if someone had spent 60 minutes with me 30 years ago to explain how my brain works and how to adapt to the normie world, my whole life would have been completely different. The same thing with genetics. If someone had done my genetics 30 years ago, my entire life would have been completely different in terms of health, well-being, focus, the addiction, everything.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And you're talking to the audience that gets it. We have, as emotional leaders, we have a lot of trauma, and we have definitely forfeited our true selves in the effort to feel like we belong, to feel like we were loved and accepted. So amen. Amen to that message and to your mission all over. So good luck with the comedy. All right. Break a leg. And thanks for being
hold on. Time out. You say that to actors.
Oh, you don't say break a leg?
No, to comedians, you say knock them dead.
Knock them dead. All right.
Yeah, you say knock them dead. It's
I
a little.
did not know that.
It's a thing. It's a thing. Like all comedians are like, we're not actors. Nope.
Okay. I come from the acting world, so
Fair enough. You can't see
yeah.
that conclusion, honestly. I get
All
that.
right. Great to have you, Sam. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you for what you're doing.
If you're ready to get off the dieting roller coaster ride and finally make peace with food and with your body, talk to a Heal Your Hunger mentor about what steps you need to take based on your own history with food and weight. Go to healyourhunger.com and register for an emotional eating breakthrough session and see how fast you can experience real change. It's a complimentary evaluation, but there are limited spots available. So go to healyourhunger.com and register to speak with a mentor today.